And once again, I want to say greetings to each and every one of you, Aquaba, and welcome to another round of the Conscious Rasta Report here on LIB Radio, LIB TV, here on livinginblack.com. My name is Kidi Owadu, aka the Conscious Rasta. Weekday mornings, you and I get together live. We come at you from 9 a.m. Pacific time, that's 12 noon Eastern time, 5 p.m. GMT, and 8 p.m. East African time. We get together with you and we deal with culture, consciousness, historical perspectives. We deal with entertainment, economics, education, health, labor, law, politics, religion, family, conflict, future studies, all areas of human interactivity and development. Today's date is Thursday. It is the 4th day of February, the year 2026 in the Western Gregorian calendar. This corresponds to the year 6266 in the Kemetic calendar, to which we have realigned our cultural clock. Welcome to the 7th millennium. You have found your family. You have found your family in a peaceful place here on LIB Radio, LIB TV, here on livinginblack.com. Woo! It has been quite a morning here. Quite a morning. I have doubled my work hours for the month of February and March. And it also means I gotta have to double the speed at which I make my transitions from my one work to another. I've been redesigning my new website, the Conscious Rasta Press. I hope you have had a chance to check it out. It is really quite exciting. I'm very excited about what's going on at the Conscious Rasta Press. And I'm also very, very excited about the program I have for all of us today. Let me click another couple of buttons over here and get everything up and running. I have to put this one over here. Bear with me. It's well worth waiting for. And now we are up and running on all of our channels. I got the Rumble channel running in the background. Hotep to you for Africa One. I see you bright and early in the house. Hotep, Brother Kidi, and global LIB family. It is an honor. It is a pleasure. It is a joy to be with you always, always, always. And to our Rumble family, to our YouTube family, to our YouNow family, to the Facebook family, you get a chance to hear us live every morning to the best of our abilities. And we are doing it. Normally, you would have heard our Thursday program. We had been near the end of a series of studies on AI. We're going to take a pause for a while we do African Our Story Month. Normally, African History Month, Our Story Month, is 1 month long. We're adding March to February. We're going to make African Our Story Month 59 days. 59 days. Why? This is the longest history in the world. We had to have the longest month in the world to tell the longest history. And all of this month, I'm featuring my books. I have about 61 books coming out. The 61st book will be coming out very, very soon. It will be online in the UK in a couple of days. And I'm very excited to be able to get this to you. I am really excited. So here's what we have going on for today's broadcast. Outrage and Moving Beyond Racism, the 2 books. Today we begin by disclosing how black and brown babies were used as guinea pigs in an LA County vaccine experiment. Exposed by the Conscious Rasta Report series from 1996. Our community-wide investigation, a lot of people participated, uncovered hidden truths about vaccines and systematic manipulations targeting communities of color. It challenged mainstream narratives on health interventions and urged blacks to protect our members against covert and racist policies. Next up, in the second more than an hour, new strategies for a new millennium. We're going to be talking about the book Moving Beyond Racism, moving to new strategies for a new millennium, where we expose how rigid racial identities are limiting, arguing that culture offers a stronger unifying force for strength, rational thought, and adaptive strategies for empowerment in the modern era. So that's what's on the table for today. We got the first book up is Outrage, how black and brown babies were used as guinea pigs in an LA County vaccine experiment. Then we're going to go to the other book. I'm very proud of both of these books. Moving Beyond Racism, New Strategies for a New Millennium. So that's what's on the agenda for today. Yesterday, if you didn't get a chance to hear yesterday's broadcast, it was powerful. For Africa One, I know you tuned in because you expressed a great interest in getting this book, and I'm going to be sending this book right out to you as soon as my account tops off. And we're going to get Mau Mau, Kenya's Land and Freedom Struggle in your hands as soon as possible. That was yesterday's study. And also yesterday, in our second hour, we did prisons, the lockdown of Black America's future. Very serious, very serious. Let me just wet my whistle because I know my throat's going to be clearing during the course of this. So I'm going to get started here. Oh, that is so good. I put the perfect amount of cayenne pepper in it. Let's get today's party started. We're going into Outrage. Let me read from the back cover. The horror of government-sponsored human experimentation, which targets quote-unquote minority infants as guinea pigs, is so unthinkable that many people will not perceive such occurrences as reality. Those who cannot accept that this reality cannot be expected, that this is reality, cannot be expected to do anything against such incidents to defend innocent babies from such demonic attacks. From 1989 to 1991, various government and international agencies conspired with the Kaiser Foundation to conduct a measles vaccine trial at 3 Kaiser facilities in Los Angeles County. In this experiment, over 700 babies as young as 6 months old were injected with a dangerous vaccine with as much as 500 times the normal pathogenic content. The same unlicensed vaccine led to the death of 1 of every 13.3 babies injected with it in one African experiment. Until Los Angeles County, this killer vaccine had only been used in the so-called third world. This episode will be registered in history books years from now, which will yield vital lessons for future generations. From the moment I came upon the story, I was convinced that this was big, to rival or exceed Nazi experiments, the Tuskegee study, and revelations about radiation testing. From the onset, I wanted to be part of that history, either creating it or documenting it. This endeavor is not about vanity or ego fulfillment, but the commitment to a life mission that is just and godly. Racist human experimentation and genocide are nothing new. We have histories of the Nazi experiments, the Tuskegee syphilis study, and radiation experiments on over 210,000 citizens. Unfortunately, there are many more which haven't seen widespread disclosure. This book is very extensive. I realized at this particular point my books were getting longer and longer. And this one certainly did deserve that. Let me begin at the beginning. Chapter 1. Brief glimpses into hidden biological research. And this story of the vaccine experiment in Los Angeles did make it to Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid. And I do appreciate that bridge, that getting from this desk, from my desk, it eventually did make its way through. KJLH picked the story up and was very supportive. Carl Nelson, I appreciate you, brother. Thabiti Umoja, my brother in the struggle, he and I were on the front line, side by side, shoulder by shoulder. Thabiti Umoja's genius definitely contributed to the writing of this book. So if you know Thabiti Umoja, the brother is bad to the bone. And tell him I was talking about him too. I love that brother. We're going through chapter 1. For me, it was in the parlance of the renowned. For me, it was in the parlance of the renowned American philosopher Yogi Berra, like deja vu all over again. The revealing article in the LA Times on June 17, 1996 was entitled, quote, CDC says it erred in measles study, and was written by veteran Times correspondent Marlene Simmons. I owe a lot to Marlene for those Times articles. Similar stories also appeared on or about the same time in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Reuters Medical News Service, as well as on National Public Radio and other media sources. It hauntingly reminded me of a similar experiment involving children, which was revealed in an Associated Press wire story in the Long Beach Press Telegram, March 14, 1994. That article, entitled, quote, Malaria Vaccine Being Tested in Africa, unquote. The 1994 story began, Washington, in the wilds of Tanzania, 600 children are testing what could be a medical breakthrough, a malaria vaccine. And here we are over 30 years later, and now they're just announcing testing of a malaria vaccine in Africa. What's been going on? It's worse than you can imagine. The new study shows the drug SPF 66 stimulates the body's immune system. By 1998, researchers anticipate global vaccination for the disease, which strikes 300 million to 500 million people in a year. 30 years later, they're now experimenting with the same malaria vaccine. Youngsters are the most vulnerable. Malaria kills 1 million African children each year. That's never been true. If we have the right vaccine and the right resources, we could reach 80% of the people in Africa in just 24 months. It could make one whale of an impact, said D.A. Henderson, Donald Ansley Henderson, an assistant U.S. Health Secretary. The Press Telegram article sparked a dark curiosity which set me upon a life-changing journey. Since embarking on that research path in March 1994, I have become considered within certain circles an authority on a number of subjects which encompass not only vaccines and child experimentation, but I have also become quite well informed about varied but related topics such as U.S. foreign policy, global demographic trends, issues pertinent to emerging nations, which have too frequently been negatively stigmatized as the so-called, quote, third world, population control activities, the widespread distribution of propaganda, and various other ingredients of social engineering. Simultaneously, I have achieved a wealth of knowledge on the natural maintenance of health, while in numerous reports archiving various examples of the profound failure of the modern medical system. As well, I have had opportunity to witness through research a massive cabal which operates a vast conspiracy and which has committed itself to manipulating the innocent of the world, including the most defenseless black and brown babies within lesser developed countries, toward the ultimate aim of reversing population growth. So the headline from the Times in mid-June of 1996 resounded in my conscience with a familiar, morbid, pale pall indicating disaster ahead. I can imagine that had someone been observing me reading that article for the first time, they may have believed I was reading a death notice for a dear friend. This miserable story in the LA Times began, quote, Washington, a government-sponsored study of 2 measles vaccines began in 1989 during a major U.S. epidemic, that's a lie, and conducted on nearly 1,500 minority infants in Los Angeles County, failed to disclose to parents that one of the vaccines was experimental. Federal officials said Sunday. Quote, a mistake was made, unquote, said Dr. David Satcher, director of the Atlanta-based Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, one of the study's sponsors. It shocked me, he said. Satcher said in an interview that the CDC plans to contact all of the families involved. That was a lie. He said he was very concerned that events not fuel suspicion in the minority community of government-sponsored medical research. Quote, every little mistake like that seeds the concerns of people. He said, we need to move to a new level of assurance so people can really trust that what we are doing. And he said, every little mistake. One baby in the LA County vaccine experiment died within the same time profile as the dozens and dozens of babies that were in the Senegalese study. I don't know how many children were in the Senegalese study, but I do know this, and I got this from the British Medical Journal, The Lancet. 1 out of every 13.3 babies in Senegal who received the vaccine died within 22 months of the injection, and it was particularly killing baby girls. And they died of an acute immune assault. In essence, they had created an AIDS shot out of the measles vaccine. The Times story went on to describe various aspects of the research project, though it generally downplayed the more controversial points. More importantly, it acknowledged an association between one of the vaccines used in the trial, the Edmonton Zagreb high titer, the European spelling for which, it's just different titer. Measles, the Edmonton Zagreb high titer measles vaccine, and, quote, an increased death rate among female infants, unquote, who received the injection in similar trials utilizing babies in Senegal, Guinea-Bissau, and Haiti. Yet on that point, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention researchers avoided direct correlation between their vaccine and the deaths among third world babies, unquote. Third world, quote unquote. The Simons piece stated, quote, Dr. Stephen Hadler, director of the Epidemiology and Surveillance Division of the CDC's National Immunization Program, said researchers have not confirmed a causal association between the more potent dose of EZ vaccine and the deaths, unquote. In all, the June 17 Times article was really only valuable in bringing to the attention of researchers such as myself the fact that this violation had occurred. Reporters at other newspapers whose pieces on the story I have collected were apparently not as impressed as I at the revelations within this article, to be little more than an echo of press releases from the very groups which had been responsible for the experiment. My own reaction was tempered by the past 3 years of digging to get at the core of this population control network and developing links between them and the immunization network. This information has been garnered from examining many thousands of pages of published reports and hundreds of hours of discussions with others, some far more knowledgeable on these subjects than myself. Chapter 2, a scandal of truly historic proportions. After nearly a month of excavating the background to this vaccine research story, I became convinced that this is truly a scandal of historic proportions. When you look at some of the confirming documents on what the Edmundston Zagreb vaccine, which was used in the Los Angeles County trials, has produced in increased mortality around the world, and consider the vast numbers which have already been injected with this and similar nasty vaccines, you might project death or vaccine-induced immune pathogenicity on a massive scale. And now there is data which suggests that this tragedy came close to having been manifested 17,000-fold, as it had it not been for the alertness and persistence of a single French investigator who investigated the process which ultimately caused the World Health Organization to cancel purchase of 250 million doses of Edmundston Zagreb. Now this reminds us of COVID-19. And I wrote this book in 1996. So you can certainly understand why by 2020, 2021, 2022, when the COVID vaccine is now being promoted, for me, there was no consideration at all. Zero consideration. Most people have never read this book, have never heard these stories. Most people hadn't even heard of Harriet Washington's article, although she did publish a very profound article on human experimentation in, what was the name of the magazine? It was a woman's magazine. Was it Emerge? It wasn't. Yeah, I think it was in Emerge magazine, Harriet Washington. She had published and was widely known to a few of us who pay attention. I'm very grateful to have this sister on my team. Very, very grateful. Least we should not be aware, racist human experimentation and genocide are certainly not new for the 20th century. We have the highly popularized history of the macabre research of the infamous German Nazi experiments. Grotesque horrors were perpetrated upon political and ideological enemies of the Nazis, including Jews, non-white Germans, gypsies, political prisoners, communists, the handicapped, and other, quote, degenerates. These crimes have been well documented, highly publicized, and institutionalized in numerous Holocaust tributes. Much closer to home, there is the legend of the Tuskegee syphilis study, which the U.S. Public Health Service, which later became the National Institutes of Health, conducted between 1932 and as late as 1972, during which well over 400 black men in the rural South were allowed to carry syphilis for as many as 40 years. This occurred during the time when syphilis treatments had come into existence that could have eliminated the deadly agent from their bodies. The men were monitored in the study through to death. Then their bodies were claimed as property of the National Institutes of Health. This is the most widely known incidence of human experimentation which involves blacks in America. Very few blacks do not know that at least a brief part of the Tuskegee story, which was documented in James Jones' popular book, Bad Blood, along with numerous documentary films. There is also the massive body of documentation which was produced by the U.S. Department of Energy, DOE, under the current Secretary Hazel O'Leary, that exposed the government's role in widespread covert radiation experimentation, which even included infants. These experiments were disproportionately conducted on blacks and indigents who took advantage of subsistence medical care. I tell people, watch out for free medicine. In the US, it's an oxymoron. In the UK, it's a standard that is so very poor standard that I would absolutely refuse it unless my life were dependent on it. For Africa One is in the house. I have the old Outrage book. Has it been updated? Yes, it has. This update, when did I do it? It was, I updated it and I changed the cover on it. But mostly it's the same. Do I have the date of the update? 2020. It was updated in 2020. So you have the old one, the Conscious Rasta Report. You've been with me for so long, beloved. I sure do appreciate, love that. We're going forward. Here's a few of the incidences which hundreds of thousands were lured into the web of human experimentation, which included injection with cancer cells, plutonium and radiation poisoning, biological and chemical weapons exposure, drugging, as well as experimental vaccine were included. Point 1, 2 medical experiments conducted by Virginia Commonwealth University Medical College at Dooley Hospital, a, quote, charity hospital for black children, and St. Philip Hospital for black adults. It was related to Dooley, which intentionally burned subjects' arms. Researchers subsequently concluded that, quote, the radiation burns from a nuclear event would be much more severe for blacks than for whites. Why? Because they used blacks in the experiments. Patients in the study were also injected with radioactive substances equivalent to a year's worth of exposure to radiation. Point 2. In 1952, a researcher from Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute injected at least 396 prisoners from Ohio State Prison with live cancer cells, half of whom were black. One of the sponsors of this study was the National Institutes of Health. The researcher Chester M. Southam was temporarily stripped of his license for committing the same act upon 22 elderly patients at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital of Brooklyn, New York. He was suspended, stripped of his license, because he got caught injecting 22 elderly Jewish patients with cancer cells. More than half, 0.3, more than 100 prisoners were given radioactive thymidine injections into their testicles between 1963 and 1971 in a research study conducted by Dr. Heller at the Oregon State Penitentiary. The test was designed to determine if sperm production was negatively affected by exposure to steroidal hormones. It is. Point. All told, according to information gathered from a General Accounting Office GAO report of testimony before several congressional committees of September 1994, quote, to date, over 200 radiation tests and experiments have been identified involving over 210,000 radiation test participants. Although not involved in a test or experiment, another 199,000 people were exposed to radiation through work. These experimental subjects included GIs, civilian employees, scientists, technicians, support personnel, as well as countless victims caught up unknowingly in government-sponsored radiation experimentation, which was frequently assisted by private business. Many of these test subjects remained uninformed as to their exposure and or inclusion in covert tests. In addition to radiation experimentation, noted in the GAO report, humans were also exposed to chemicals, nerve agents, irritants, psychochemicals, biological warfare agents, bacterial tracers, and mind-bending drugs. Point. At the California Medical Facility during 1967, 68, 64 prisoners were paralyzed with succinylcholine, a neuromuscular compound which caused some to feel as if they were suffocating or being drowned. Some of these subjects were forced against their will to take the drug after they had initially refused to participate in the experimentation. The Institute's Special Treatment Board had granted permission to force inmate participation. And last point, over 40,000 U.S. GIs have developed serious disabilities as a consequence of their service in the Persian Gulf War arena. Their claim of, quote, Gulf War syndrome has been linked in part to the use of at least 2 unlicensed and experimental vaccines purportedly designed to combat biological attacks with botulism and anthrax, along with 15 other vaccines administered simultaneously, as well as the use of an unproven antidote to nerve agents and a dozen or so other toxic experimental environmental exposures. The Uniform Code of Military Justice mandates that GIs cannot refuse to participate in a government research experimentation. And it goes on and on and on. This is from a disturbing article posted on the internet, written by John R. Woodward. It can happen here. Quote, his article wrote, between 1977 and 1982, 4 doctors and a social worker at the Children's Hospital of Oklahoma in Oklahoma City monitored the births of babies with spina bifida. Parents who were poor were told that it would not be appropriate to treat their baby and given an extremely pessimistic picture of their child's future life. Parents from better off families were told more about the treatments for spina bifida and given more optimistic and accurate information about their child's potential. None of the parents knew that they were part of an experiment. Harriet Tubman's excellent 1994 Emerge magazine article, Human Guinea Pigs, is the primary source for most of these citations. Her comprehensive piece is much more extensive than space allows me to note herein. I recommend her latest release book, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present. For much more in-depth inquiry into racist human experimentation, it is outstanding journalism. I'm going on to skip through the chapters. Chapter 3 was the discrepancy between public statements and the facts. And there were many public statements that were absolutely outright lies, false. Chapter 3 includes a couple of these, just a couple. Number 1, the major U.S. outbreak, quote unquote, of measles, which officials continued to claim prompted the experiment, was made more ominous by lumping figures for 3 years in a manner so as to produce the misconception that the high numbers were being reported annually. Thus, the figure of 55,000 cases of measles reported during the epidemic announced to an average of only 367 cases per state for the 3-year period. 367 cases per 50 states over the 3-year period. 2,476 children hospitalized for measles during the periods averages less than 17 per state each year. And 35 deaths among those children is less than 1 death per 4 states each year. The claim of 121 to 130 total deaths from measles during the epidemic amounts to less than 1 death per state each year. It thus stands that the major measles outbreak, quote unquote, was far less deadly than the significant rate of increase in deaths associated with easy, high titer vaccine experiments recipients in developing countries. In essence, the establishment relied upon propaganda to hype up a relatively minor disease outbreak. Point two, it has been stated that the hospitals where the experiments were conducted were selected because they served communities hardest hit by the disease, including East and West Los Angeles and Inglewood. And that fact alone accounting for why 88% of the subjects were black or Hispanic children. Yet when we examine medical research articles which have been published in the study, it has become evident that certain other questions were being investigated, such as antibody mediation, neutralizing the impact of maternal antibodies, natural immunization passed on from the blood of the mother to child while in the womb or during the extended period of natural breastfeeding, and perhaps eugenics issues. Or as one credible vaccine researcher put it, quote, officials were collecting more data on black babies in the states to see if the vaccine only kills African blacks. Data suggested that the absence of maternal antibodies would not likely have been greater among this target group for two reasons. Number one, babies in these groups could have had relatively higher rates of breastfeeding than other population groups, and two, the high rate of foreign-born mothers of the children should have had more naturally obtained measles antibodies, which come from having experienced measles as a child. Thus, external analysts, supported by volumes of data, suggest that the communities were targeted for this experiment, most likely because the affected families were ill-informed, of marginal financial or political clout, and of specific racial groups. The CDC admits that, quote, the race ethnicity of the initial enrollees were 44% African American, 44% Hispanic, and 12% other, which made them prime test subjects. It is contrary to common sense to blindly accept the claim that these babies were targeted because of their proximity to the epicenter of a somewhat overrated measles epidemic. And it goes on. I talk about more and more of these absolutely contradictory points we have to know about. There are a bunch of them, probably 12 of these points that absolutely contradict. Let me read one more. The CDC's chief investigator in the LA study, Dr. Stephen Hadler, who had been involved in foreign trials of the EZ high titer vaccine, was quoted in the Times claiming that the death of babies in the foreign drug trials was due to the condition that, quote, many of the babies were malnourished and did not have access to adequate health care, unquote. Yet this claim is at direct odds with numbers of peer review articles published in prestigious medical journals, some of which directly address the problem of a high mortality death rate from high titer vaccines, referring specifically to the Edmonton Zagreb measles vaccine trials in Senegal, Haiti, and Guinea-Bissau. Thus, published claims that researchers could not have confirmed a causal association between the more potent dose of EZ vaccine and the deaths is a very misleading statement, contradicted by volumes of available scientific data which were published in highly reputable journals. And it goes on, page after page after page, more and more, talking about the discrepancies between public statements and the facts. This book, to the best of my ability, contains the facts. Chapter 4, the nature of human experimentation. There's nothing natural at all about it, and it does violate numerous laws. We talk about what happened in the Gulf War syndrome, where the veterans used as guinea pigs for drug and vaccine experimentations during the 1991 Persian Gulf conflict. I do cite certain laws that are supposed to be in place to prevent involuntary human experimentation, especially without disclosure, such as the Nuremberg Code is a 10-point declaration governing human experimentation, developed by the Allies after World War II in response to inhumane experiments. The code states that voluntary and informed consent is absolutely essential from all human subjects who participate in research, whether during war or peace. The Nuremberg Code dictates that number one, the subject shall have the legal capacity to give consent. These babies did not. Point two, they shall be able to exercise free power of choice without intervention of force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other coercive force. And three, should have sufficient comprehension of the elements of the research subject matter so as to make an enlightened decision. Toward the latter aim, researchers must clearly and in detail explain the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, means and methods of its conduct, and illustrate all hazards which might be expected, as well as any ill effects on health which may possibly result. The Nuremberg Code has no provisions for waiving informed consent from military personnel, a provision for which U.S. law, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, has established overriding provisions. Then there is the Declaration of Helsinki. Years after the development of the Nuremberg Code, the World Medical Association met at their 18th Assembly in Helsinki, Finland, in 1964 and adopted a set of recommendations to be used as an ethical code under which all medical doctors conducting biomedical research involving human subjects would operate. The Declaration of Helsinki was further revised in 1975, 1983, and 1989. It distinguishes between clinical, therapeutic, and non-clinical, non-therapeutic research. It sets guidelines for, quote, proxy consent, by which human research subjects who are not legally competent, such as infants, children, and adults with mental or physical disabilities, are to be utilized in such projects. Then there is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Common Rule, first developed by DHHS in 1974 and adopted by the 16 U.S. government agencies on June 18, 1991. The Common Rule defines limits by which federally funded research involving human subjects within the U.S. shall be conducted. However, under this set of guidelines, quote, local institutionalized review boards, IRBs, may revise or exclude some or all consent elements if the research exposes subjects to no more than, quote, minimal risk, meaning that the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examinations or tests. This area of ambiguity undoubtedly leaves an open window by which researchers with covert intentions can bypass more restrictive guidelines. The Los Angeles County measures vaccines, Los Angeles County measles vaccine trials seem to have taken advantage of such loosely defined restrictions in certain areas while resorting to pure deception in others. The mitigating phrase here is, quote, the term, quote, minimal risk. Then there is the National Health and Medical Research Council, and there are 11 points under which they must operate. I'm going to skip over that. Also, other regulations on human experimentation include the proposed international guidelines for biomedical research involving human subjects published by the World Health Organization and the Council for International Organizations of Medical Science in 1982. So we're going to move forward. I was assisted in this research by a number of people, including Worth Cooley Prost. And she told me about these experimentations taking place around the world. I'm skipping over parts of this, but it's hard to do. But I've got to move forward. Similar NIH financed human trials involving experimental HIV vaccines are currently underway in Haiti, Central and Southern Africa, as well as in Thailand. Even more outrageous, some of the babies enrolled in easy high titer trials in Haiti and Zaire were discovered to have been included in the long-term HIV positive studies. HIV diagnosed babies were injected with extra high dosage versions of vaccines containing live pathogens. According to study records published in 1993, infants who died in global EZ trials were not noted as to their HIV antibody status. This critical detail deliberately excluded from mortality figures. According to Cooley Post, Prost is her name, Cooley Prost. She's now, I'm pretty sure she's going on into the ancestral realm. Quote, according to her, it is unknown exactly how many of the babies died. As to the 22-month-old boy from the Los Angeles trial who died, the death was attributed to, quote, a rare bacterial infection, Clostridium difficile enteritis, which is said to rarely occur in children, but is more common in the elderly and those diagnosed as HIV positive. Thus, two questions come to mind. Number one, were there any children enrolled in the LA EZ vaccine trial who were HIV diagnosed? And two, did the baby boy whose death was noted by the CDC researchers have an HIV antibody positive status? If this were found to be true, then this would certainly be a scandal of monumental proportions. Then I talk about, in chapter 5, title, Evidence of Increased Mortality. I'm going to skip over this chapter because it's just too complicated. Evidence of increased mortality. One paragraph I'll share. The Lancet article, where I found much of this research on the death of the babies internationally, the Lancet article contains numerous tables, charts, and graphs which clearly illustrate the fact that by 1988 there were significant differences in mortality among the various vaccine groups. The same document contains the following relevant excerpts. There was no significant difference within the study group in mortality by sex, and that turned out not to be true. The finding of excess mortality in the vaccinated group was responsible for two reasons. The incidence of measles was low during the study period. Otherwise, there might have been measles deaths between 5 and 10 months in the standard group who received a placebo at 5 months. And the measles case fatality rate was also low as a result of intensive medical care provided during the project. The only child who died from measles was away from the study area and was a non-participant in the study. A quick cost-benefit analysis suggested the strategy of using high-titer vaccines early in life is not worthwhile. 1,000 children reaching age 5 months seem to be associated with the use of high-titer vaccines. This number exceeds by far the reduction in mortality expected from the early vaccination, estimated to be 4 per 1,000 children reaching age 5 months, reduction in mortality. If these findings are confirmed in other settings, other strategies to reduce mortality from early measles should be developed. And it gets getting a little complicated. I'm going to skip to much later in the book. And now let's talk about, well, this is from the update. And this is very important. This whole update, I forgot I even put this update in this book. Chapter 14, Update 2021, Chaos Amid COVID Mass Injections. Vaccines, Scientific Voices of Dissent. As I predicted, In my June 2020 book, Panic, What Coronavirus Pandemic Tells Us About the State of the World, we could expect this fear, panic, and hysteria over the pandemic to be drawn out for the entirety of the 2020s decade. This imperative to push the notion of a widespread, out of control infectious epidemic is not so much merely a matter of fundamental science, but a drive to disrupt humanity's social, political, economic, and personal patterns. And it did that. Read the book Reset by the World Economic Forum. It upset all of that. And now we have evidence that it was deliberately designed to upset the global order. We have that document. This global manipulation is directed toward the aim of reducing the rate of population growth. It must be noted that this feared population increase has been taking place mostly among nations of the Southern Hemisphere. By July 2021, news reports in the U.S. and nationwide were increasing pressure daily for every one of us to submit to experimental vaccines, quote unquote, prescribed for the COVID-19 pandemic. Yet they all seem to exclude from their reports a significant body of science-based dissent against these mass injections as the best strategy. Why is the COVAX regime so committed to only one perspective on the science surrounding this coronavirus? Our ever more insistent calls for, quote, mandatory vaccination, unquote, ultimately an initiative that violates our basic and affirmed human rights to refuse non-consensual participation in human experiments? Here's what a few of my colleagues have had to say regarding the scientific contradictions. Dr. Gary Null, quote, in fact, nothing you're hearing about the vaccines is honest, close quote. Dr. Null's Progressive Radio Network broadcast transcript contained the following. The White House press secretary makes a statement. Now, mind you, when she makes a statement and it's emphatic about it, then you have to assume that this has been fact-checked and is accurate. Well, she was fact-checked. She is inaccurate, completely inaccurate, concerning COVID and the, quote, vaccines, unquote. In fact, nothing you're hearing about the vaccines is honest. So we'll bring you up to date on some reality checking on vaccines. Another of my long-term colleagues, the great researcher Celia Farber, has a long record of investigative journalism exposing the contradictions between science-backed data analysis and COVID news reporting by much of the mainstream media. In an online report entitled Adverse Incident Reports Show 966 deaths following vaccination for COVID-19. Here's what Farber's analysis had to share. Quote, according to adverse incident reports collected by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the Food and Drug Administration, 966 individuals have died after having received an mRNA vaccine for COVID-19. Between December 14 and February 19, 19,769 reports were made to the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, VAERS, following immunizations with either the Moderna or the Pfizer BioNTech mRNA vaccines, the only two vaccines given during the time period assessed. At this time, VAERS data is not available after February 19. The 966 deaths represent 5% of the total number of adverse event reports. Of those who died, 8.9% died on the same day they got the shot. An additional 129, 13.4% died within 1 day. An additional 97 died within 2 days and 61 within 3 days. A total of 514 53.2% died within a week. 173 died within 7 to 13 days, 106 within 14 to 20 days. 85% of deaths occurred in individuals over age 60. Below 60, there were 5 deaths among those aged 20 to 29, 8 deaths aged 30 to 39, 20 deaths aged 40 to 49, and 57 deaths to those aged 50 to 59. Please note, Celia Farber is citing data from U.S. government resources, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, along with the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. Why should people like Celia and other independent science writers and myself, why should we be subject to censorship on social media when we interpret these data patterns to our audiences? Why wasn't Celia Farber's analysis published in mainstream media? Another long-term friend and investigative journalist is John Rappaport. John Rappaport still is condemning all of that. I'm going to have to move forward. And right now, we busted the whole COVID thing. Let me go to the conclusion of this book. And this is very, very important. I do talk about my article. I wrote an article, and I forgot I even put this in this book. This article, I put it in the book, is entitled MABs and the Risk of Viral Mutations. Monoclonal antibody immune therapy introduces risk of mutation of novel zoonotic RNA virus species, unintended consequences of the enhanced function of COVID-19 and mass vaccination, by Kidi Owadu, December 2020. I wrote, a spectrum of minimally regulated and extraordinary pharmacological procedures has created an unprecedented environment for the potential emergence of the most dangerous infectious pathogens to have ever affected humans and other species. Currently propagated across a large global environment are procedures such as gene editing, gain of function experimentation, monoclonal immunotherapy, and the use of non-human species in vaccine cultures, mutagenic chemotherapies, unintended amino acid sequence mutations, antibiotic resistant pathogens, and other modern medical therapeutic approaches. It seems inevitable that these procedures in unusual combinations raise the specter of unintended and highly aggressive pathogenic mutations. The world's current microbiological regulatory environment is inadequate to prevent spontaneous mutation of new pathogenic species of infectious superbugs of the future. Under a worst case scenario outcome, this could lead to an extinction level event for untold millions on the planet. Did the rush to distribute mass vaccination for COVID-19 create a possibility of the world's 6th extinction level event? Whew. And that's just the introductory paragraph. That was the abstract. The article, my article I wrote, goes on for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and more pages. MABs and the risk of viral mutations. So in conclusion, let me go to the conclusion of the book. And I have to go through this fast because I've got a lot to cover this month. 60 books in as many days. Conclusion. A spectrum of minimally regulated and extraordinary pharmacological procedures has created an unprecedented environment for the potential emergence of the most dangerous infectious pathogens to have ever affected humans and other species. And I'm just kind of repeating that. And then there is an extensive bibliography for the book. And I do include that bibliography. The book is called Outrage: How Babies Were Used as Guinea Pigs in an LA County Vaccine Experiment. So I encourage each and every one of you, get the book, the update of the book. As you said, she says, I have the old Outrage book. Has it been updated? Yes. The whole chapter involved now on the COVID vaccine, which to me is part of the extension of this. I want to take a moment here, wet my whistle. The next book we're going to talk about, Moving Beyond Racism, New Strategies for a New Millennium. I propose that clinging to race as a central theme of identity has become limiting and too often a barrier to rational thought. On the back cover, I write, vaguely defined front lines characterize one, quote, racial group, unquote, from another, based upon an inconsistent range of variables, including skin pigmentation, physiological features, the geography of birth, and religion, despite the fact that even within each, quote, racial group, such measurements differ widely. Along the fault line separating one group from another, within each race, camp, individuals, and organizations stand ever vigilant, hoisting the banner of racial pride as a rallying cry, all the while insisting upon their self-anointed sanctimonious leadership. I propose that we consider that adherence to a central theme of racial identity has become limiting and too often a limit to rational thought. We can shift to the significance of culture as a unifying force. I have become convinced that it is culture and not race that is the more practical unifying force for the future. Culture is the only only partially determined by, quote, racial identity, and that is an inconsistent variable. I don't know why I had such a hard time reading the word. This is such an important book. Such an important book. I did dog ear one page, and I'm going to read this. Is this limiting or what? Should one choose to count time from the oldest African calendar, and we're talking about culture now, historical perspective, today's date is not 1997, but 6237, and that the seventh millennium began in 1760 AD of the Gregorian calendar. As such, the skewed perception of time is one clear example of the limitations of strict Eurocentric logic and perception. The following excerpt from the great African scholar Sheikh Anta Diop, from the essay entitled Africa's Contribution to World Civilization, the Exact Sciences, fixes the Nile Valley as the origin of accurately recorded time. This is why when you hear me introduce the show every day, I always give the time according to Gregorian calendar and the time according to the ancient calendar of ancient Kemet. I got this from This Is My Source. Sheikh Anta Diop wrote, the oldest calendar from Africa's Nile Valley high culture, Kemet, also spelled Khemet, can reliably fix a recorded history of 6,237 years. That's 365 days and 365 days plus one quarter. The first one contains 12 months and 30 days, 360 plus the 5 epigomenal days, which were dedicated to the birthdays of Osiris, Horus, Seth, Isis, and Nephthys, the 5 Egyptian gods. And we did fix that by attaching those 5 days to the beginning of the Kwanzaa season. That's the Kwanzaa season now. I talked about that over the Christmas holiday. So methodologically speaking, Osiris, which is Osar, was indeed, no, that's Horus, Heru, was indeed born the night of December 25th, as was Jesus Christ, who can be compared to Osiris in this case and in many others. However, the Egyptians know that the civil year of 365 days was 1/4 of a day shorter than the solar year. This meant that their civil year calendar slipped steadily backwards through the solar year. A half a day every 2 years, and 1 day every 4 years. Therefore, as early as the 4th millennium BC, 4,000 years BC, the Egyptians had already created the leap year. However, it was remarkable that they preferred to choose a time lag of 1,460 years in order to add a whole year instead of adding 1 day every 4 years. Indeed, this time period of 1,460 years is the period which separates the two heliacal risings of Sothis. And that's a very, very important point. It may be kind of confusing to you, but this is why I do say it is a different calendar that we use based upon our own knowledge. Where did this concept of race begin? It was European mercantile capitalism, in league with the institutions of Europe's dominant religions, who raised the banner of race-ism. And racism, I spell it RACE-ism. Ism means doctrine. This is the doctrine based upon our melano content and other physiological features being our determinant that we are a separate race. That's just not even close to being true. Of course, it was sure to follow that in fomenting this climate of mass psychosis, powerful interests would use their own physical characteristics as standard for the highest perceived type. That which was the most opposite to them would be regarded as substandard. As such a notion was confirmed by their scientific anthropological studies throughout the centuries. But can we trust that those who created this data are not also self-appointed race intellectuals? Reading, quote, "The modern conception of race owes its widespread diffusion to the white man. Wherever he has gone, he has carried it with him." This was how Professor Ashley Montagu put it in his book, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. Along with that conception came the accompanying notion of genetic superiority. Of course, it would only be natural that those who came up with the concept of racial differentiation would place themselves at the top of the genetic hierarchy. This stands at odds with a basic understanding of genetics and the necessary tendency of the pale phenotype, let alone the power of the chemical melanin, which gives color to those of the equatorial zones. So moving forward into a new millennium, what I am proposing is that the progressives and even radicals began to move beyond the limited perception of dogma and doctrines inherited from Europe's dark ages. A more enlightened viewpoint, or more accurate determination of what constitutes human species, would certainly provide a foundation for building a brighter future. Today, we find ourselves backsliding into broad-based racial ethnic conflict and race-baiting propaganda that has become increasingly prevalent. To emphasize and to promote group priorities centered around cultural foundations of 1, language, 2, religion, 3, history, 4, traditions, 5, moral precepts, and 6, logic. Those are the 6 axioms of culture. This is the main theme from the book. This seems to be a more enlightened approach. Even within nationalist spheres of interest, to organize upon these broader axioms would produce a more cohesive movement. Instead of appealing for race unity using physical characteristics as justification or colorism, we might find that we can better organize among those who think, speak, and function as we do over generations and express common values within a shared culture. Now, I did begin this book with a couple of quotes, and I'm just going to share one of them. You did hear the other from Ashley Montague. Dr. Michael Parenti wrote this: Fascism, especially the Nazi version, had an explicit commitment to racism. As you all know, human attributes are said to be inherited through blood. Genetics and biology are said to justify the existing class structure, just as our academic racists today are doing with their bell curve theories and their warmed over eugenics. That quote from Dr. Michael Parenti, very powerful quote. So, exiting the European mode of thinking, even as we're speaking about entering a, quote, new millennium, we must understand that the dominance of the European mindset influences even our perception of time. What year is it anyway? We went over that. Is deprioritizing race heresy or progress? The major complaint I have received when proposing this shift of priorities away from race identity and toward cultural axioms is the question of what then to do with the white man, unquote. I must admit that it is difficult to purge oneself entirely from contempt accumulated from centuries of abuse, criminality, and genocide. It would be incorrect not to acknowledge that in the name of their beloved white race, European nations and institutions have committed the planet's most notorious crimes. Thus, the question of redemption for those of European nationalities may not be resolved until 1, institutions make amends for the vast profits which have been generated from crimes that have been committed. 2, that they acknowledge that their nations have been the despotic rogues of the planet. And 3, they settle into relationships with non-Europeans which are not white supremacists in nature or destructive to the culture of non-whites. It is hard to see evidence that this series of changes in fundamental European values will occur on widespread scale soon, but inevitably such an adjustment will eventually take place. The fact is that demographic changes are taking place on the planet that will make new superpowers of nations which were not too awfully long ago subservient. This new power alignment will move the more industrial developed countries to newly found appreciation for non-hostile relationships. As to those who will religiously hold on to race as a fundamental determinant of identity, I can understand the dilemma that this new way of looking at ethnicity, race, and culture could pose. I have met no small amount of resistance when bouncing these themes, as expressed in this essay, off of acquaintances, yet the most self-actualized people with whom I have discussed these ideas have been recipient to the argument that it is culture, not race, that determines the behavior and character of people. I am not asking that anyone give up the essence of who they are, but what that would be like asking a zebra to give up its stripes and becoming an ass. What I am proposing should be clear. The axiom of clinging to race identity and continuing to divide up the world between black, white, red, yellow, and brown people has become a burden. It is limiting and an impediment to logical thought. I propose that we deprioritize race and bring additional emphasis to the 6 axioms of culture: religion, language, traditions, history, logic, and values. And I would say not history, but historical perspective, because you and I can share a history, and we can share a history with others not like us, but it is our perspective of that history that is aligned to our culture. Around these 6 paradigms, a whole new way of looking at the world and at ourselves can be developed. As a side benefit, using such criteria, we of African descent in America won't have to be saddled with having to defend the dysfunctional behaviors of Black Americans, such as Dennis Rodman, Whoopi Goldberg, the Wayans brothers, Clarence Thomas, and O.J. Simpson. What a relief that would be. So I do then go into, and I just read just the first chapter, the introduction. Then I go into the rest of the book to define these 6 keys, these 6 axioms. Chapter 2, culture is key. The 6 axioms of culture. Point 1, a comprehensive Black history study must include evidence of Black culture. 2, American history is primarily founded upon European culture. That which is called Black history has generally followed this focus by beginning at enslavement. Point 3, African history is noted by the development of the culture of the various tribal groups, as well as the birthplace of human civilization. Africa has over 1,200 distinct ethnicities. Looking at the 6 axioms, I'm comparing Africans in America to Africans around the world. Culture, axiom, language. For the American, includes American English and Spanish. For Afri-Amers, American English, Ebonics, and Spanish. But for Africans, language includes French, Swahili English, and 1,200 indigenous tongues. Let's look at spirituality, comparing American religion, Christianity, atheism, and Europe. Greece is the origins of all of that. Afro-Americans, Christianity, and Islam. For Africans, includes Amun-Ra in the beginning, Christianity, Islam, as well as animism. That is everything is alive. Everything bears the spirit of the nature. And Judaism is the birthplace of all of the Abrahamic religions. We actually see them coming from the African continent. History, Americans, Western conquest, and the calendar year 1997, the writing of this book. For Afri-Amers, history, enslavement, civil rights, calendar, and the calendar year 1997. And for Africans, on spirituality, Nile Valley to neo-colonialism, calendar year 6237. Looking at traditions, American, fashion, sports, commercialized holidays, military, and entertainment. For African Americans, traditions include music, sports, commercialized holidays. For Africans, seasonal holidays, art, the birthplace of world civilization. Values, American values, dollar worship, racism, sexism, consumerism. For Afri-Amers, values include ranging from family-oriented to widespread criminality. For Africans, centered around the village life, and tribal loyalties. Not saying these other things don't exist in Africa, but there's definitely a core cultural distinction. And lastly, on logic. For the Americans, competitiveness and xenophobic, afraid of the unknown. For Afri-Amers, the logic, dependency. For Africans on the continent, logic, accepting and non-competitive. To distinguish ourselves as a people, you must have a culture that is shared by your community. Are blacks in America culturally more African or American? In the future, clashes along the cultural fault lines will separate the world's dominant cultures from one another. They will be more significant than the conflict between the so-called races or nation states. There is truth. There is, in truth, only one race. In these future culture wars, which will increasingly come to resemble population wars, where will those of African Americans' ethnicity find themselves? Sitting on the fences between two aggressors engaged in a hot war is a horrible place to raise one's children. Standing on the fence between two hostile wars. And then I go on to break this down even further. Western culture, chapter 3, Western culture from an African perspective. I do use the book by Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race between 4500 BC to 2000 AD, from his book, serves a critical launching pad for a generation of scholarly studies on African-centered education. Chancellor Williams was himself on the cutting edge of a 20th century rebellion against European-centered analyses of Africa's contribution to world development. His book rejected the, quote, Tarzan of the jungle concept of Africans as savages, one step away from primates who contributed nothing to the world before being rescued from primitive society by slavery and later Christianity. Williams wrote in the preview to his landmark book, quote, my own history classes were only a part of the rebellion against the only kind of textbooks available. It was a general rebellion against the subtle message from even the most liberal white authors and their Negro disciples. You belong to a race of nobodies. You have no worthwhile history to point to with pride. Chancellor Williams' book is a fundamental text in the current push to reinstall African-centered historical perspective, as well as to recover that essence of the true soul of Al-Kebalan, the dark continent, in the consciousness of Africans throughout the globe. Additionally, good-natured Europeans, Arabs, Asians, Latin Americans, and others around the planet will do their African brothers and sisters well to familiarize themselves with and show proper respect to the works of historians such as Chancellor Williams. Then I ask this fundamental question: what is Western civilization? We acknowledge that asking fundamental questions about the nature of Western civilization is also opening the door to volumes of analysis, opinion, and historical review. Yet as we are examining this phenomenon referred to as Western civilization from a pointedly African-centered view, I think it can be done with much clarity, using simplified explanations. That which is known as Western civilization, or the West, is built upon a mix of political ideologies, philosophies, religion, genealogies appropriated from other cultures, and a history marked by brutal conquest. The West today struggles to maintain global regimen committed to a fundamental reliance on aggression, materialism, and paternalism. Western countries consist mainly of people of European descent, the heart of which is Central Western Europe. Western civilization now includes the former socialist states, but with the end of the Cold War, old enemies have now put aside their differences to defend the white race from a 21st century onslaught from fertile people of the South. Other nations in the world, in the West, include Canada, Australia, Israel, New Zealand, individual Caribbean island nations, and the most rabid modern defender of everything white, America. Increasingly, such countries as Japan and Korea have thrown their lot in with these so-called Western nations. The lines which have divided civilizations become further blurred when transnational economics demand such. White must be clearly noted. What must be clearly noted is that surprisingly little of that which we refer to as Western civilization is in fact originally of that part of the planet known as the European continent, itself a false construct, as this landmass defies the true definition of a continent and would be more correctly defined as either Eurasia or Western Asia. When we further break down political ideologies, philosophies, religion, and even the origin of royal bloodlines, we can understand the significance of the claim that little in Europe is truly original. I'm going to skip over, and we did ask the question, did civilization originate with the Greeks? They refer to George G.M. James' phenomenal book on that subject, Stolen Legacy. Greek philosophy is stolen African philosophy. And I would further submit my book, Standard Omission, The African Origins of Greco-Roman Medical Systems. Very important book. We do talk about the Iceman inheritance, prehistoric sources of Western man's aggression, racism, and sexism. Many have dismissed Bradley's book, Michael Bradley's book, as vulgar sensationalism, no matter that the author himself is of the European ethnicity. It does serve well to note the basic premise of Bradley's analysis that the cold and harsh environment of Europe instilled an anthropological imperative on the white culture to become a brutal killer in order to survive. The ice people reality. Imagine that the Iceman had to wake up 4 months of the year in a brutal cold season. Before the development of the use of fire, he had to wrap himself in the furs of the animals which he had slain, beaten over the head with a club or a rock, just to survive the bitter cold of the caves in which he slept. Next, to eat, he had to go out and find a fresh new carcass. For extended periods of the year, there were no fresh fruits, nuts, berries, roots, and leaves to gather. Today, the European's idea of a highly desirable meal is a large, often bloody slab of meat. Eating animal flesh has become the centerpiece of the diet for a large part of the Western world's inhabitants. Another part of Western emergence is the role of animals in intimate relationships with people. And someone recently pointed out, and since I found out about it, it's pretty consistent, that white people name their dogs names. Stephen, William, whatever. But non-white people tend to call their dogs not people names, but other names. That was really interesting, and I found it to be pretty consistent. Our caveman probably got so close to his dogs and cats, trying to keep warm on those cold nights, realizing that he could not only cover his own naked flesh with the skins of animals, but a living animal up under the sheets with him could provide further comfort. One might further imagine that on a few of those long, cold, and lonely winter nights that our caveman woke up missing his mate, only to be confronted with the hot, stinky breath of his pet wolf. While it might sound ridiculous to purport that the cave dweller was into bestiality, we must question why one can today obtain pornographic films and photographs which show European-descended men and women having carnal relations with dogs, cats, and donkeys. And haven't we all heard persistent rumors about old Homer down on the farm with his gumboots and the sheep, or perhaps his nasty little trick with the chicken? Intimacy with household animals is a distinctly Western tendency, and pets are still welcome in some bedrooms. And I do mention why when you go to the zoo, why you don't find very many animals at the zoo from Europe, because they ate them all. The next chapter deals with the Sun People reality. This is the Sheikh Anta Diop's theory of the cradle of two distinct civilizations. Meanwhile, in other parts of the planet, particularly in equatorial and tropical zones, life presented another type of reality. Despite the seasonal monsoons, the inhabitants of this part of the planet were greeted nearly every day of the year with a warm and friendly sun. Along with other people of color of the southern hemisphere, the African woke up, stretched his rejuvenated body, went outside, and poured a libation to the beloved ancestors and the generous spirits of nature. African men and women had good reason to be thankful. All about them were fruits, nuts, berries, leaves, herbs, roots, and grains in bountiful abundance. They were surrounded by lush tropical rainforests, which contained not only the foods that they needed, but bounteous animal species and herbs. Of course, the Africans, along with other Sun people around the world, had coexisted with animals. But such cultures record well that this was not so much a brutal dominance, but mutual respect. This symbiosis reflected a fundamental spiritual consciousness founded upon man's integration into the whole of nature. This stood in stark contrast to those who had migrated to the cold climate and became stranded, that they needed brutal conquest of nature. This fundamental difference is not difficult to comprehend. Simple survival for the European needed to conquer nature's harshest environment. The Sun people merely had to yield to nature's harmonious order. And it goes on. I didn't talk about the great suffering robbed us of our birthright. And again, the great suffering of the transatlantic enslavement process we now refer to as the Ma'afa, the great suffering of enslavement. The great suffering of enslavement, the Ma'afa itself, could have occurred only after nearly 2,000 years of continuous conflict between African civilizations and those who invaded from the north. These invaders emerged from the desert sands of Western Asia, hence renamed the Middle East. Accurate records of just how many living beings were consumed in this holocaust of enslavement will never be completed. Specific projections put this figure at 10 to 60 million, while others place it as high as 600 million. And that 600 million would include the children and grandchildren of those who were stolen and their babies born on this side of the Atlantic rather than being born on the mother continent. 600 million Africans missing from history. Should be noted, during the period of Europe's most massive outward migration, the population of Europe still increased by 427%. This compares to an increase in Africa's population from the 17th to the 19th century of less than 10%. Thus, could one calculate the hundreds of millions who were missing from the African motherland during that period? That the majority of those taken were young people with many productive years ahead of them. African societies were severely impacted by the capture of so much human capital. And I'm going to start to wrap it up. This is all so very important. As any of us can rightly claim that we carry traces of the royal lineage of Kush, Ethiopia, Kemet, Zimbabwe, Mali, Songhai, Zulu, Cuba, Ashanti, Zongo, Indonga, Matamba, Angola, Yoruba, Igbo, Maasai, and hundreds of greater and lesser kingdoms of the golden ages of the dark continent. Any and every one of us of African descent in America, the Caribbean, Central or South America, has the right to claim direct royal lineage. It was not just the peasants and village inhabitants who were enchained and cast into the unforgiving belly of slave ships. Princes and princesses, griots, scholars, midwives, healers, mystic prophets, and juju men made that journey also and gave us the stuff of their bloodlines. And then I talk about the problem with racing people based upon those myths. And we do, again, cite the book by Ashley Montague, Man's Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. I didn't even get through I got through about 1/5 of the book. You need to have this book, don't you? I do see you in the house. Ote Hunter J. Hello, he says. Greetings to you. Great to have you in the house. And what a joy it is to have you in the house. Quote, yes, in Jamaica, cats are often referred to as puss, dogs, darg. I remember my African friend naming her Afghan dog, Tamale, meaning hairy. Yeah, that's true. While the Europeans named their dogs Ben, Jerry, Mary, Sally, Lisa. There is this distinction, and I'm glad that you know that well. The book, I got through this much of the book, and I skipped over huge chunks of that. This book is very, very loaded, and the book is very well priced. I lowered the price so it's like $12.99, $11.99. I'm going to recommend you get Moving Beyond Racism, New Strategies for a New Millennium. And also in our first hour today, we talked how babies were used in the LA County vaccine experiment. Outrage, why we are so absolutely positively outraged at such behavior. And that's what we do here. I did put up the links, and he says, yes, from Nairobi, Kenya, to Kikuyu, much love. I hope you got a chance to catch yesterday's report, which the first hour we detailed from my book, Mau Mau, the Kenya's Land and Freedom Army struggle. And we named all of those glorious heroes of the revolution, Bildad Kagia, Fred Kubai, and so many others. Didan Kimathi, General China. I am a Kenyan at my heart, and I owe it to my people to inform our family about our glorious history. Today you heard us extend that history through the Ma'afa, the Great Enslavement, and we're reconstructing as rapidly as possible our identity so that we across the diaspora can come home and build the most glorious, most powerful empire in world history since we ruled the planet at the beginning of these great and powerful empires. Empires such as Kemet, Kush, Mali, Aksum. Great empires. The great Swahili Empire. That's what we're calling this new reconstruction across Africa. I am coming home. We've been reading from the books. I hope you appreciate what we shared today. If you can, please tune in tomorrow. All of this month and the next month, we're going to be covering these 61 books now that I have published. It's going to be a great day in your neighborhood. It's going to be a great day in my neighborhood. I want to thank you. I'm going to put up the links real quickly here. Let me just pause this, and I'm going to put up the links to the two books that we covered today. I have this pulled out in a separate file over here. And the first book, I'm going to put this book up for your benefit. Ote Hunter J from Kenya. This is what we got it yesterday. Yes, I got it well. Okay, here, let me put up this link so people can have it in case they need Kenya's Land and Freedom Army struggle. And we also, yesterday, we did prisons, the lockdown of Black America's future. Today, we covered two more books, and that is this book. And she says, what time tomorrow? The time will be 8 p.m. East African time. And that is 9 a.m. here Pacific time, as I am on the same time as Los Angeles, as we are broadcasting from Las Vegas. And here is the link to today's first book. We covered Outrage, and in the second hour, we covered the book Moving Beyond Racism, New Strategies for a New Millennium. The book challenges rigid racial identities as limiting, arguing that culture offers a stronger unifying force for progress. It critiques divisions by skin color, geography, or religion, urging Africans and the diaspora to prioritize cultural strength, rational thought, and adaptive strategies for empowerment in the modern era. So that's what this is all about. And I want to thank you all for tuning in today. You've been tuned in to LIB Radio, LIB TV, and livinginblack.com. I hope this is your favorite. We're going to do everything we can to stay true to our mission. And that mission, ultimately, is all about empowering our people, African people, all around the world. I am, because we are truly, truly moving towards a new definition of our destiny. Thank you all for participating today. And it has been a good day on your favorite. We aim to be your favorite. We are LIB Radio, LIB TV. We are living in black.com. Peace and prosperity.